Hi and welcome to today's webinar where for the next 45 minutes we're going to be discussing probity, integrity and good governance. I'm Genevieve Jacobs, I'm the Group Editor of Region Media and your host today, and we're joined by Dr. Julia Cornwell McKean, who's a specialist in probity and regulation, and Chaz Savage, who's the CEO of Ethos CRS. Our panel will also be taking your questions and you can send them to us in the Q&A section at the bottom of your screen. Chaz and Julia, great to have you here discussing this topic. Never more important for a multitude of reasons, and we'll get to that. But Julia, I wanted to start with a definition if we can. What do we mean by probity, and what's a probity advisor? What do they actually do?
Probity is one of those words where you think, oh gosh, I don't know what that means, but actually you do. You've just never actually heard the word before. The technical thing, probity is the evidence of ethical behaviour, and the technical definition is that it's complete and confirmed integrity, uprightness and honesty. And so what that means in practical terms is that when you're making decisions, that you're doing them with proper process and integrity and ethically.
Mm-hmm. So what does the probity advisor do then? Taking that notion of probity, which is fairly familiar to us, that's about good ethics and the underlying principles of good governance, and we'll get to that, but what does the probity advisor do?
So as a probity advisor, generally I provide oversight from a probity perspective to government clients and sometimes not-for-profit clients who are undertaking competitive processes. So they could be procurements, grants processes, those sorts of things. So anything where there's likely to be competition. And what we do is make sure that the rules are followed, that the rules are set up and the rules are followed, and that everything is done properly a whole way from go to woe. We're an independent advisor, and we are able to say at the end of a process, if it is the case of course, that the process has been upheld integrity and been done ethically.
So you mentioned the rules there.
Yeah.
Now, it's about the rules, but it's also about making sure that the rules are the right ones. It's not simply about saying, did you tick every box, is it?
That's right. So the rules need to be fit for purpose. So in some procurements, for example, high value ones, you might actually have a probity plan, which lays out the specific rules that you intend to follow in relation to probity. That would cover things like record keeping, security, confidentiality, managing conflicts of interest. Those probity plans are very important for people to read. I always say you need to read it, you don't need to memorise it. There is no test. It's one of those documents that you go, oh, this has happened, what do I do now? But one of the things I like to say to my clients is that have a look at this probity plan. It's important to have these rules, but if there's anything in here that you think you're not going to follow, that in practical terms that's not going to work, then we need to rethink those rules and make them fit for purpose. And with the COVID environment, a number of the probity plans have needed to be tailored to deal specifically with security and confidentiality in a different way to what it may have been for many years prior.
And Chaz, I might just turn to you as a business owner yourself, and this idea of having the rules can often be, well, it's a safety net in some senses, but also it can stop people from examining whether the rules are indeed fit for purpose. It's got to be grounded by some kind of ethical consideration, hasn't it?
Ethics underpins probity.
Yes.
So the worst sort of organisation adheres to the formal, literal, specific letter of the law and ignores the spirit and the practice. So integrity and an ethical culture in organisations is the foundation for probity, but then processes are built so that the basics of administrative law if you're a public agency or corporate law if you're a private agency are properly followed. Mm-hmm. So it's a way for organisations to embody an ethical culture in practice.
And I guess that's where we're going with this, because the rules are one thing, the ethics have got to be there as well. And Julia, I think many individuals or organisations would say, well look, we're quite clear on our ethics, we've got a code of conduct, and in fact those ethics have been codified and some time might have been invested in them. So if an individual or an organisation follows an ethical code of conduct, why do they need a probity advisor?
It really depends. It's horses for courses, you know, whether it's a particularly high risk project or program. bringing in capability can be a real problem. People, don't run competitive processes, procurements, grants, licenses very often. So having that probity overlay helps keep them on track, and the earlier the better. So you might get a probity advisor in to hold your hand, help you out, and help you shape those rules at the beginning, not after, to make sure that they are fit for purpose and produce the best outcome. Having that probity overlay also helps drive competition. It drives mutual trust and respect. It helps industry understand that everything's on the up and up. And the criticality of mutual trust and respect from industry, the community and government is that drives value. That means the government will get better outcomes, and ultimately in government, these are public funds that are being spent. There needs to be accountability and transparency, and having a probity advisor making sure that all those rules are being followed and best values being achieved can be, provide that mutual trust and respect that I mentioned.
So I'm imagining from what you're saying that it's a good idea to bring in the probity advisor at the beginning. There'll be organisations that need to retrofit that though. Do you face a bit of backlash against that? Do people say, look, we know how to do our jobs, everyone here is, decent and ethical and we're all clear on what we're doing, why would we need you?
Oh, look, from time to time, some of my work is that I do come in the beginning and I help from the beginning through to the end. Other times there has been a probity incident, something's happened, and someone said, oh, hang on, we need to get a probity advisor in to see how we can address this issue. And sometimes you need to bring people on the journey. There are often people who think we know what we're doing and just paying lip service to probity. But the more that we can service and help, probity's not there as a roadblock, it's an enabler. It's helping everyone achieve the best that they can and make the process as effective and efficient as they can. And sometimes we have people who are, no, and then once the journey's complete, they're really very grateful.
Gee, a probity incident sounds a bit scary, doesn't it, Chaz?
Well, I think that's the exact point, that whether you're a large government organisation spending billions of taxpayer money or a company spending shareholders' money, you've got to generate value for what you spend. And probity is an important part of that process to ensure we're making the correct decisions at the right time, grounded on the necessary evidence, which is we've got 3 competitive quotes that are fairly acquired rather than a whisper from my cousin, who happens to run a business on the side.
Yeah.
So it's just an integral part of doing business well. So the other point is important, I think, that everybody to the world says that they're ethical. The evidence is that some people are, some people aren't. Some organisations are at a time, in other instances they're not. And so what we're doing is formally capturing and ensuring, as far as we possibly can, that ethics is built in to the framework of how large organisations or small organisations operate.
And I guess what you're getting at there too is that a probity incident is often in the grey area. It's not necessarily a matter of outright unethical behaviour. Perhaps it's something that's just happened because someone thought, this will just be easier. We know these people do a good job. Let's just short circuit it. We're all in a rush and there's a lot to get done. It's as easy as that.
And that's absolutely the currency of the time at the moment.
Yeah.
All governments have had to face the challenge of how do we respond to COVID, and large programs have been put in place which require public servants to just do astonishing things. The issue is that you shouldn't do that. The issue is that, according to what standards do we turn on a penny and deliver something instantaneously and seriously?
Yeah.
So it's not this point about we've all been doing this. No. Well, let's justify to the extent that is necessary a new model of behaviour.
And I guess, Julia, and I can see you nodding at this too, that the way we categorise probity and what that means has to recognise that there can be some fuzziness around here, and that there may even be people who believe that they were doing the right thing for the right reasons, that it was just a shortcut, that something would just be easier and better for everyone if they did it that way.
Look, nearly all probity incidents are human error or genuine mistakes because they just didn't know better. You know, from misdirected emails are actually the most common probity incident that that I see. Accidentally sending an email to industry instead of to a colleague. You know, and there's some procedures that could be put in place to mitigate risks. So, yeah, absolutely. It's very rare that corruption is detected, though, you know, it is a risk and one that's elevated at the moment.
Chaz, as someone who's running a small business, to what extent do you think that probity and ethics are an integral part of your operating framework then, given what you've just said? I mean, how do you build that in from the very beginning?
Well, as a business, our model is to be a transformational partner. So what we say to the people we work with is, in the first instance, we've got your back. We seek a long-term steady relationship where we add value each step of the way. And if we're grifters, liars and cheaters, we're not going to last commercially. So there's a real commercial point to us as a company that wants to stay around. Our reputation has got to be spotless. The commercial sharp point for companies who don't act with integrity, who don't have probity processes in place, is at some stage they will trash their reputation. They will trash their business. They will end up in the federal court. They will have royal commissions rummaging through their administrative systems and teams.
Yeah, look, I'm minded of what the Institute of Company Directors often says, for example, which is be able to tell your story, which is not invent something afterwards, but think from the very beginning, have I ticked every box? Have I done everything? And have I thought through the processes? And that's what you're arguing. But the probity process that we'll talk about a bit today can be quite a formal process.
Yeah.
So for you, again, as a business owner, an employee approaches you, for example, and says, look, I think there might be a problem here. How would you undergo taking on probity advice or a probity investigation rather than doing something informally? What's the value?
So for us, because we are a small business, our practices are, we cut our probity practices to the cloth that we are. So we don't have elaborate and formal processes because our executive and our decision-making team is small and we're completely transparent. And I suspect that's the case with most small to medium enterprises. You know, we don't over-egg governance because we're immediately and directly accountable to a board and shareholders. That works really efficiently. The issue comes when we work with government agencies or corporations who come to us with formal requests that we have to respond to.
Yeah.
And so we're very happy in that environment. We understand that that's a cost of doing business. We have to satisfy in our work for agencies that we represent value for taxpayer money, and we gear our responses to that. And we win on our merits. You know, either we make a compelling case that, you know, we're the ones for you, or we don't, in which case we go back to the drawing board and think again. Sorry.
I was just going to say, Julia, perhaps you could sort of illuminate this. When would you be called in as a probity advisor? What are some of the sets of circumstances?
So there might be particular programs that are lengthy programs, so I might be involved from the beginning of a consultation through an expression of interest process, then maybe a formal tender process and right through to debriefing. So it could be the whole thing. Or it could be, like I was mentioning, a probity incident. Someone has sent an email to the wrong person and our whole process might fall over. Help us, what can we do? Can this be saved? And I might be called in to assist with those sorts of things. You know, it's almost 50-50 which way it goes.
Is there a threshold for the size of the organisation where you might be asked to do a probity audit, for example?
No, the foundation of good decision making, it could be a very small organisation, almost always government, or it could be a very large department. So it varies greatly. I learn many things about many things that I never thought I would find out about as a PhD in musicology, I could tell you about a whole range of things.
Oh, look, I do want to focus for a moment on procurement capability frameworks.
Yeah.
There have been quite a few attempts to set these, to define these, to put these in place and in motion along the lines of things like leadership, procurement analysis and risk management, cost management, the legislative and the policy environment and the like. Do you think that procurement capability is a problem then in the public sector, despite those fairly robust efforts?
It certainly is capabilities, one of the probity principles in Victoria, and for people who know me, I'm well known saying the nerdy thing that it is my favourite probity principle, because capability is so essential that the people who undertake procurements have the right training, support, knowledge and information to undertake the the procurement. But if they don't have that, they understand their own boundaries and know where to go to get that information or that expertise. Now, public servants who are in line areas doing their day job may not regularly actually undertake procurements. There might be a brand new policy, they need to buy something, and they're directed to an intranet. Some organisations have great, particularly the bigger ones, great information that they can use. Others, people can get very lost. The Auditor General actually recently said at ANAO in his mid-term review that procurement capability is low among the public sector, and my observation is that it's highly variable at all levels of government. And I don't necessarily blame people for that. As I say, it's just that they're not doing it every day. It's one of those skills that, the rules do change a little bit every so often, and if you're not doing it regularly, it's hard to keep abreast of that.
There's some worrying consequences for that though, aren't there, Chaz? Yeah. I mean, what happens if government doesn't get this right? What are the consequences?
Well, Julia mentioned Grant Hare as the Auditor General in his mid-term report, just highlighting a startling figure at the level of the Australian government, which was in 2018-19, the Commonwealth procured $68 million worth of services through AusTender. Sorry, 68 billion. I missed a few zeros there.
A lot of money.
68 billion. There's a big difference. So that represents huge investment by the Commonwealth. And if you get 1 billion or 2 billion or 5 billion or 10 billion of that, not wrong, but less than optimal, you're actually wasting precious and scarce resources.
Yeah.
And there's a real opportunity cost to that. Basically, we could have spent our money better in other areas, and society, instead of having value created, has value shredded. There's a really interesting dilemma faced by organisations. So I think of the Department of Defence, which is regularly in the news because there's cost overruns on large projects. And I've actually got a little bit of a soft spot for those projects because they are so complicated. What's defined at the beginning changes over the life of the project. The lead times are long. Information is scant. And so, to my way of thinking, a cost overrun on a defence procurement is entirely to be expected. What's important is the decisions and justifications in the process at each stage, so that when new information comes to hand, that's incorporated in a way that captures value.
And I think that goes back to the point we made right at the very beginning of this, which is that probity is about more than simply following the rules.
Yep.
It's about whether the rules are fit for purpose,
yep,
whether we can assure ourselves that there's been ethical, thoughtful conduct
yep,
throughout the process.
Yep.
Julia, on that, I know you live in Victoria. Lockdown must have had some impact on organisations' code of conduct, given that we've got a lot of people working from home. It's quite possible, we're hearing discussion that many more people will continue to stay at home, at least for part of their working lives. So you don't have that face-to-face oversight necessarily. What are the consequences of that been?
Look, I found it to be very interesting in Victoria that there's a lot of published guidance from the integrity organisations in Victoria. So IBAC, the Information Commissioner, the Public VPSC have all published guidance about integrity and maintaining integrity, following the code of conduct from home. Just to think about how these things have changed. People are working sometimes side by side with multiple people in the same room, and yet those requirements of those code of conducts, confidentiality is still actually a requirement. And how do you manage that? Then there's the issue, sadly, that you just don't know if that public sector employee is the only person with a job at the moment in that home. And corruption and procurement is a vector for corruption. And if someone maybe is in a situation when they need to put bread on the table in these difficult times, it's possible that they may find themselves doing something that they might never have thought of doing before. And so as a consequence, it is recommended that integrity training actually shouldn't be, oh no, we won't do that because everyone's off-site. Actually, we should do that because everyone's off-site, and give people those integrity reminders.
And again, to that point, that perhaps where the issues are likely to arise is not necessarily dreadful intent, but wavering around the rules, a bit of push and a shove there, a little bit of uncertainty, things that take place where you're not necessarily as supervised as you might be if you're in the workplace itself. Chaz, there has been discussion for years about establishing a national anti-corruption body, like the one that some of the states have. Obviously, New South Wales has a long history with ICAC. Been resisted for a long time. Why do you think that might be? $64 question there.
Look, I appreciate that. Thank you, Jenny. Sunlight, the blaze of sunlight is uncomfortable. So an anti-corruption commission illuminates the worst of government and the worst of people in government. And so, of course, that's an unpleasant political pill for governments to swallow, because the consequences are, premiers are held up in public as not acting as they should. And so there is scar tissue there. So I think the reluctance emanates from political self-calculation. I don't think it's an issue in probity. I think that a national commission, its time is right, its time is now, and it should be a proper commission rather than a fig leaf.
Yeah, it's an interesting one to conjure with, because, Julia, we're having a lot of conversation in the public sphere about this lately for a number of reasons, a number of political reasons. And there's been, from some political leaders, suggestions that the New South Wales model, for example, is a trap, or that the federal model is toothless. How do you respond to what Chaz has described there about the need for a national anti-corruption body and how far that could reach?
What I can speak of is what I take from, we've seen with ICAC and IBAC. From a public perspective, from the perspective of those who live within the public sector, work in the public sector, I feel that they have a strong educative function. We learn so much from what they find, and we see lots of publications coming from IBAC in Victoria and ICAC in New South Wales that are actually helping the public sector to elevate and improve on their processes, from the way they manage conflict of interest to also, those who might be minded to do something they shouldn't, to get an idea that actually if you do, you'll probably get caught, because look at all these terrible cases that have happened, from people who have changed their names, changed their children's names so that they can recruit them into roles, to people who have been have a massive wine cellar because they've been buying wine on the company credit card for years. Amazing stories that who would have thought. And then, we all heard about the recent situation with the cleaning contracts and V-line and bags of money. And that's only just this year. So it does happen, but I think it, as I say, serves a warning, but there is that important educative function about those things. And one, conflict of interest is a big one. People don't always understand it and what it is and how it should be managed.
I mean, absent bodies like IBAC and ICAC, there is no probity framework that's national in any sense, is there? I mean, unless you're looking at criminal codes of the criminal code.
Well, the definition of probity actually is in the Commonwealth and in Victoria is the same, but the principles are all slightly different. But you know, they're slightly different. They're more or less the same. They're all around this integrity, and you know, all of the states have codes of conduct. I mean, the difference between government employees and employees elsewhere is we are obliged to protect the public. We must work and make decisions in the best interests of the public, and we are governed by a code of conduct that is the law. And that is critical, and that is why probity is so important.
There's always the law to conjure with, Chaz.
And agencies do work according to, you know, very well known, I'm talking about the Australian government now, published guidelines by the Department of Finance. So there is a framework that is that exists, that is publicised, and that is followed to according to Grant Hare, to a greater or lesser degree. So capability compromises the ability of an agency to faithfully follow practice according to finance guidelines. The value, I think Julia's spot on, the value is educative of, the value of a anti-corruption commission is educative in the first part. We've all, as citizens, been told with national security legislation or with tax audits or whatever, if you're doing nothing wrong, you've got nothing to fear about legislation of a particular type. Well, the same argument can be made to agencies, to politicians, to members of parliament, that if you're doing nothing wrong, then why would you care about a national anti-corruption commission or an integrity commission? What we see, though, is all of us fall off the wagon at some stage. It's just part of human life. But the publicising of poor practice, the publicising of practice that is not ethical, actually serves as a real salutary lesson for agencies. You know, I don't particularly want to talk about sports because we only have limited time, but the consequence of sports rorts has agencies thinking about, well, how do we actually follow administrative law? How do we discharge our duties properly? How do we keep proper records? I mean, who would have thought that that's important? How do we not put our decisions into the shredder? And that's high in mind of agencies now, as it should be.
I want to ask a couple of questions that are coming in from people who are listening on the webinar. One being, and Julia, perhaps this to you, are there solutions to reverse probity incidents? Can companies and employees recover from their wrongdoings? I guess, do these things always end in someone losing their job one way or another, or is there a way to address them better?
Look, I tend to think that once you stray from the path, it's difficult to claw it back, but it depends on the nature of the incident. You know, assess the risk. Is it material? What can we do? You know, certainly there have been processes where, you know, say a request for tender and it's just unrecoverable. And if you forge ahead, it's only going to get worse. So, you know, it's a bad thing. In fact, the last decision you should ever take to throw out a tender when you've got X number, you know, industry have put in all this effort and money in towards their tender responses. But then, you know, there are times when it can recover, and sometimes that is, as I mentioned, I might be called in as a probity advisor. There's been an incident. We want to stick on the straight and narrow from here on in. And, you know, so they can get through that from time to time.
So you think you can rescue these things, but I guess on the basis that people are alert to the possibilities all the way through.
I think that's right. I think that's right. Like conflict of interest, for example, should be done at the beginning of a process. Everyone should complete a conflict of interest form and shout out whether they have an issue. And then they should check that periodically when tender responses come in. For example, I've just seen my next door neighbour is working for that company. I didn't know that. And then see if it can be managed. But there might be a conflict of interest midway through. You didn't know as an evaluator until you were reading it that your brother's wife has just taken on a new role at this company, and for some reason you're very friendly, you can't continue to be involved, and we may need to get a brand new evaluator. I mean, that's not ideal, but those things happen, and it's conflicts of interest are not bad. Undeclared conflicts are bad, unmanaged conflicts are bad.
And that goes back again to sort of laying the good foundations, that if everyone has declared their interests in the first place, you then get to the point where you say, well, is there a conflict? But if we're all clear in the first place what those interests are, then that's the building blocks that you can work on.
However, as I say, if you find out something down the track, very important to revisit and not just keep your mouth shut.
This is a really critical point. Just as in project management requires a project management plan to adapt to circumstances and the information that comes in over the life of a project, so too with probity. It's not, we've done this on day one, it's filed and then gathers spiders and dust. It's actually a resource that is really important over the life of a program or project to guarantee again that the decisions generate value, that they can be justified, and we're secure as an organisation.
Here's a question that comes up quite a bit, and I think you will have heard this one before, Chaz. Doesn't probity prevent the government from being agile, which is one of those buzzwords? We all want to be agile, we all want to be efficient. Won't the kinds of things we've been discussing, they get in the way, they're a bit of a roadblock.
And nimble as well.
Yeah, nimble.
Proper process is intrinsic to good government. So the bedrock is, and I'll take procurement as an example, if we are to be nimble, we have to procure and have our probity processes, the proper decision making, aligned to our business processes. So we actually have to think clearly about what it is we're procuring and why. And with that hard work done, then comes in the proper process. And with that hard work done, then we can say, right, we're in a dynamic environment, we've got to move really quickly, these are the proper exceptions we're going to make, and we justify it for clear reasons, with clear reasons. So for me, probity and proper process it's a part of life. What kills and what makes government inefficient is not process, it's inefficient process. And that goes back to the bedrock, why are we procuring this? What value does it create? How does it align to our business processes? How is it integrated into practice? What value does it generate?
I'd love to get your take on that, Julia, because this does bubble up. There are certain personality types in any business or organisation who say, let's just not get hung up on all that stuff. You can waste so much time on this. We're all okay. And that's one of the questions. Being agile and nimble and efficient is a good business goal to aim for.
Yep.
Won't it slow it down?
Look, I don't think so, because equally so is accountability and defensibility and transparency, which means that decisions need to be well documented and thought out, risk assessed. I was asked by a group of Year 10 students at a webinar, about 3 months ago, if I ever regretted a decision I ever made when I worked in government. And my answer was no, because I had my own personal governance framework around those decisions where I considered all the evidence, I considered whether I had the capability to make the decision. I drew in experts, much like we've seen in the COVID environment. Get the chief health officer to give the advice, not the premier. I risk assessed, made sure that I was making decisions in the best interests of the public, and everything was documented. And if you do all of that, you can't regret what you've done. It might not be the right decision, but but you've made the decision properly. And that's what probity is about, making the decision properly, whether it's a big one or a small one.
Although, if you do it well, following on the lines, it should be a pretty good decision.
Yeah.
There's a reason why proper process is followed in government. It's because government is really hard. Running a major corporation is really hard. Issues are complex. The low-hanging fruit is gone. We're in a dynamic environment, and so proper process and having your probity baked into process is just a way to get better decisions.
Yeah, look, it just strikes me, speaking, Julia, that maybe the whole COVID thing in Australia is not a bad analogue for this, because the way that we responded, which has been effective and very useful for us and has kept us all sitting here talking to one another, rather than locked down with tens of thousands of people sick or dying, that is grounded on people being open and transparent and taking expert advice and seeking that advice and bringing it into the processes of government. So we actually, as a whole, across the nation, can probably feel quite pleased with ourselves about that initial response.
Absolutely. I think we've been exposed to the way decisions are made and good leadership and bad leadership throughout this in a manner that we never have before. I mean, when I used to try to explain capability and bring in expertise before, people would just look at me blankly. But all I have to say now as Chief Health Officer, yeah, I get it. Yeah. And that whole foundation of good decision making and some of the bad decision making we've seen. And, as we did mention earlier, there are special rules for emergencies that are cut down versions of what is actually required in the procurement frameworks, but they still require transparency, accountability, evidence, risk management and documentation.
Yeah, so just because you're in a hurry, just because it's absolutely critical and urgent, doesn't mean that you throw out the entire process.
Indeed.
Yeah. Another question, integrity is not black and white. How do you measure it? Who's the authority on it in Australia and how reputable are they? I don't know if you can answer that, Julia.
That's a good question. I don't know who the authority is. I mean, it's a bit of it's a holy question in a way. We talk about it in terms of minimum practice and best practice, I guess, and that whole thing that I mentioned earlier, that in all of our governments, employees, there is a code of conduct, there are values, and we all need to be the policemen of one another. If we think that something, when you're in the public sector, and even if you contract to the public sector, is amiss, you have a responsibility to speak up, because it is a requirement. Not only if you see someone doing something that is wrong, or you believe is wrong, you're obligated to report it as well. So I guess the answer is all of us are responsible for saying, what is the right behaviour and what is the wrong behaviour.
And I guess that's something perhaps, Chaz, that we haven't explored just as we come to the towards the end of our time, is that there is a level of individual responsibility that operates here. And we've been talking a lot about processes, we've been talking about rules and what's fit for purpose and the value of this at a sort of an organisational level. But the process also has to support individuals, doesn't it?
Yeah. So, individuals are part of the process.
Yeah.
You don't have a process without thinking, animate human beings who make decisions and who are responsible for the decisions they make. So, if I could just perhaps boil it down to something really personal, when I'm working with staff and when I'm looking for staff, there are three things that are really important in order. The first is attitude, and that's the ethical uprightness with which people walk, and their ability to solve problems in an ethical way. Then comes energy. So you've got to actually do stuff rather than just utter stuff. And then comes expertise. So given a base level of intelligence, and we work with intelligent professionals, people learn stuff if they have attitude and energy. And that goes over to the culture that's created in an organisation if the leadership is right. So the individual is really important. Without a decent individual, an organisation falls away. It crumbles away from the bottom. But without the leadership that says this is what is important and this is how we will work, then equally you're damned from another direction.
So Julia, we are all authorities on integrity, in a sense. It's down to all of us in our everyday working lives.
Oh, absolutely. You know, if you see it and it's not right, call it out. So yeah, absolutely, we all should be. I mean, there will be people who are corrupt, and perhaps they're not the ones who are going to call it out. But we all need to have an eye for that. And as suppliers to the government, you know, we equally need to comply with those code of conducts and be aware of them.
Okay.
I wouldn't like to underestimate how hard that is sometimes.
Yeah.
You know, I'm sitting here very comfortably in this chair and nothing's at stake. When the stakes are high, then I understand that the personal pressures on individuals and the costs individuals pay for calling behaviour out is really high. It's extreme.
Yeah.
Which is why the frameworks are so important. Which is why all this is so important, because the costs are borne by humanity, by individuals who call it out or individuals who suffer as a result of corrupt conduct.
And I guess if we summarise what we started with at the very beginning, was that probity needs to be embedded into our processes, that we need to be not afraid to ask those questions, to call people in for external assistance, to know that there is something that people can fall back on. Because if we go back to sort of the very basis of one of these things, and you know, you've mentioned, Julia, a couple of times, things like it's as much as an email going astray or something else going wrong, you've got an individual somewhere there who has either concerned by what they see happening, is concerned by where they feel they themselves are being led. That's at the basis of all of this. And so they need to know that processes are robust, that people understand what the limits are, and that there's something for everyone to work with. It goes nowhere without somewhere that people can work with it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Look, it's been an absolutely terrific conversation. Thank you to our audience for joining us today, and thank you to everyone who's watching on the website or through the YouTube channel. And Ethos CRS will be delivering the public training workshops in 2021, so please visit our website, ethoscrs.com.au, for more details. There will be a bit of a break for Christmas, but they'll be back with new topics in February. It's been terrific to talk to you both, Chaz Savage and Dr. Julia Cornwell McKean. Great to have your time. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Genevieve.
Okay.